In February 2022, Singapore did something it had not done in 44 years. It sanctioned a superpower, no UN mandate, no regional consensus, just a small island nation drawing a hard line alone. Now, 4 years later, Singapore's Prime Minister is expected to fly to Kazan, Russia, and sit across a table from Vladimir Putin, the same man, the same state, and Singapore still has those sanctions in place. This is the story of what it actually costs to have principles, and what it costs when you don't show up. The Kazan tightrope, when Singapore sanctioned Russia and then had to sit at the same table. 4 days after Russia vetoed its own condemnation at the United Nations Security Council, a tiny island nation did the unthinkable. It broke 44 years of diplomatic restraint. It bypassed a paralyzed Security Council, and it unilaterally froze the bank assets of a global superpower. For Singapore, this was the moment the bill for having principles arrived. And now, 4 years later, Prime Minister Lawrence Wong is expected to fly to Kazan and sit face-to-face with Vladimir Putin. Act 1. The country that dared to say it. In 2022, Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan broke a cardinal rule of Singaporean diplomacy. For nearly half a century, Singapore had maintained a strict boundary. It would only enforce international sanctions if they were mandated by the United Nations Security Council. What happened in February 2022 was the first time Singapore had acted unilaterally since Vietnam's 1978 invasion of Cambodia. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs delivered a remarkably unvarnished admission of vulnerability. The MFA stated it plainly. The invasion was not a theoretical principle. It was a dangerous precedent for any small state. Ukraine, the foreign minister noted, is much bigger than Singapore. This was not Western-aligned idealism. Singapore was not trying to save Ukraine. It was trying to cement the global rule of law that protects Singapore's own existence. In a world where large states can erase smaller neighbors, sovereignty becomes a conditional lease. If small states do not defend that principle, it will vanish. Act 2. Alone in the room. Singapore walked out onto that limb entirely alone. The rest of Southeast Asia reached a completely different conclusion. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations issued 3 collective statements on the conflict. All 3 were criticized for their vagueness. Russia was never named as the aggressor. Vietnam and Laos maintained deep Cold War military ties with Moscow and repeatedly abstained from United Nations votes. For Laos, the calculus was explicitly financial. According to Nikkei, Russian gasoline ran approximately 70% cheaper than international suppliers. Meanwhile, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand shifted from early caution to quiet abstention. Economic survival overrode principle. Across Southeast Asia, immediate economic survival and diplomatic hedging overrode abstract principles entirely. ASEAN notably refrained from naming Russia as the aggressor. Moscow retaliated swiftly. In March 2022, Russia placed Singapore on its official list of unfriendly countries, restricting transactions involving Singapore entities and freezing high-level diplomatic relations for 4 years. Yet Singapore had no choice but to continue operating as the economic heart of a region that was actively trading with Russia. Act 3. The port that cannot choose its customers. Here is where principle and economic reality collide directly. When Singapore drew up its sanctions, it froze major Russian banks, including VTB, VEB, Pромsvazbank, and Bank Russia, and halted military-grade exports. But it left Russian oil completely untouched. Singapore is the world's largest bunkering port. Its maritime dominance runs on a river of fuel oil that cannot be turned off without catastrophic disruption. When disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz choked traditional supply chains, Singapore turned heavily to Russian fuel oil. That trade remains legal under G7 price cap rules, which set a ceiling of $45 per barrel. The numbers tell their own story. By the end of 2025, Russian fuel oil discharges in Singapore hit record levels. In its busiest single month, the port discharged 770,000 tons of Russian fuel oil. The $45 per barrel price cap is not just a legal ceiling. It is the loophole that keeps Singapore's port competitive. The commodity funding the state Singapore sanctioned is the very same commodity keeping its global port alive. Act 4. First contact in 4 years. Now the bill has come due. June 2026 marks the 35th anniversary of the ASEAN-Russia dialogue. The summit in Kazan is Singapore's first high-level engagement with Russia since the 2022 sanctions. Prime Minister Lawrence Wong is expected to attend, sitting directly across a table from Vladimir Putin. The options carry equal risk in opposite directions. If Prime Minister Wong attends, Moscow state media will exploit his presence as proof that Western-style isolation has failed. If he stays away, Singapore appears locked into a Western ideological camp, severely damaging its identity as a neutral and independent hub. As of the time of recording, Singapore's Prime Minister's office has not officially confirmed attendance. There is no quiet middle option. Singapore's 2022 stance made it highly visible, and that visibility means every move it makes now carries outsized symbolic weight. Your principles make you relevant. Your relevance ensures you can never make a simple, unnoticed move. That is the small state trap. Act 5. The price of the seat. This dilemma reveals a deep, permanent friction running through Southeast Asian geopolitics. ASEAN has maintained Russia as an official dialogue partner throughout the entire conflict, even as a majority of its members voted to condemn the invasion at the United Nations General Assembly. The bloc is built on absolute consensus and non-interference. For nations like Indonesia and Thailand, that total flexibility is a feature. It allows them to glide through geopolitical storms without taking direct damage. But for Singapore, the same structure creates a persistent tension. Singapore is committed to an absolute rule of law, yet it is anchored in a bloc that deliberately avoids taking stands. By attending Kazan despite its sanctions posture, Singapore is exercising its own strategic agency. It signals to the global south that a principled stance does not require permanent isolation. Look at where Singapore sits on this diagram. Most nations have to choose: high principle or high pragmatism, condemn the invasion or attend the summit, protect the rule of law or stay in the room. Singapore is attempting all four simultaneously. That is not contradiction. That is the deliberate management of two imperatives that cannot be separated. Because for a small state, abandoning either one is not a strategic choice. It is strategic suicide. How much does it cost a small state to have principles? And what does it cost when you choose not to show up? The answer is the same in both directions. Principles cost you a seat at certain tables. Absence costs you a seat at all of them. So you do both. You state your case clearly, so the world knows you will not go quietly. Then you get on the plane and you sit at the table anyway. This is the brutal, honest calculus of small state survival in a fragmenting world. I am Hero the Hornbill, and this is the ASEAN angle. If this episode gave you a new way of seeing the region, subscribe so you do not miss the next one. New episodes weekly, link in the description.